Hi, and welcome to this special presentation on the current situation in the war between Israel and Hamas. The rules, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. None of our guests here, our panelists, are academicians. We are individuals who care deeply about these kinds of situations and will reflect our viewpoints as we go through. I'm going to present a secular presentation. Some of the other presenters may be more inclined from an emotional or personal or connected perspective. That said, we'd like everybody to be respectful. These are obviously going to be difficult topics for people to discuss. That said, we love questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat and address those to the panelists you want to talk about. Basically, the way this is going to work is that we're going to have a discussion with panelist presentations. I'm going to start for about 15 minutes, sort of walking through general concepts about what's going on here. Then Ralph will give a position relatively close to the Israeli left on how these should, on his perspective and on what's happened. Noorul will give a presentation more from the Muslim side and sort of explain his perception of what's been going on. Aaron will give a presentation from a military perspective, explaining some of the nuts and bolts of how the events happened and how we can analyze that from a military view. And Greg will provide some views from the Russian sphere. And we hope that all of our different presentations might be something a little bit different than you'll see in the news media, because we're going to go in depth with the history, with those cultural connections and so on. And that should get us about the first hour, 10 minutes. And then after that point, we're going to take your questions. And if you direct them to a specific person, right, you'll write that in your comment. I'm more than happy to direct those questions to that person. If you don't, then I'll choose the panelist that I think is the most appropriate to answer, myself included. And that will be the next hour and a half. All right. So as I said, it's going to be 2.5 hours between everything. This is going to be recorded, so if you can't catch it all now, you can see it later. And we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where all of this will be. In fact, you can see updated presentations from our group. And if you go into the meetup link for this event, you can also see the history presentations that I've given that are directly pertinent to this event. So if you think that I haven't covered everything in depth here, don't worry. There are 6 hours, 8 hours where you can get really deep into the weeds. You can also join our meetup to find out about future events and see other meetings that we may have. And of course, this is for free, but if you like what we're doing, please donate. These are the links. All right, so these are the sort of points that I wanted to sort of address today. I wanted to sort of talk about, why does everybody care? What is some of the recent history? What are some of the diplomatic situations that are surrounding this? What actually happened on the 7th of October, like just nuts and bolts? Why didn't Israel foresee this? Or how did it not foresee this? What Israel is now doing in the Gaza Strip, and to a lesser degree in the West Bank. What are the Egyptians doing, and what is their perspective? And finally, the question that's sort of on a lot of newscasters' minds of when, if, how will this become World War III? So the first point I'm going to handle, right, is why does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict writ large overtake much larger conflicts, right? In the world, there are around 14 million Jews and 11 million Palestinians. So we've got about 25 million people who have a direct interest in what's going on. But it seems like a lot more people care than those 25 million, right? And you've got much larger conflicts like Ukraine, the Jalisco cartels in Mexico, Yemen, which was engulfed by civil war, Ethiopia, where over 600,000 people have died between 3 different conflicts over the last decade. South Sudan is very similar. Libya, which is still in civil war since 2011. Artsakh, which is a country that now literally no longer exists because of a war that took place in September. All these conflicts are immensely overshadowed by this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I sort of wanted to address why that is. And while we are going to talk about the history, I think that the history is mostly irrelevant for why people are interested in the conflict, right? For a lot of people, this conflict serves as a litmus test for other kinds of politics, other kinds of uh, other kinds of situations. And so, for example, these exist, at least to my view, along five major axes. The first one is whether or not you support American expansionism, American power in the world. You think it's a force for generally good. It's promoted peace. It's promoted international trade. It's promoted international development. That it's promoted democracy, and these are all good values. And so those people who generally support that perspective generally tend to lean more pro-Israel because Israel is a huge part of that American foreign policy piece. Those, on the other hand, who see America as one of the largest hegemons in the world, invading and destroying other countries, creating increased global destabilization, those people tend to be more pro-Palestinian because they see the Palestinians as a response to American hegemony through Israel. You also see perspectives that align on the concept of Western power and Western growth. And so there are the people who say that Western values, that a Jewish return to their homeland, and the rights for minorities to protect themselves in the Middle East, those are people that tend to be more pro-Israel because they see Israel as an instantiation of Western values and Jewish development and minority ethno-nationalism. And then on the flip side, you have the view that these kinds of actions are an imposition of European values and ideas on people who are fundamentally non-European, right? Those people who are anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and who see this in a construct of oppressor versus oppressed. The next one, of course, is the relation to Jews, right? Those who are generally anti-Semitic, we'll get to white nationalists in a bit, but those who are generally anti-Semitic tend to be pro-Palestinian because they are anti-Israel more than they are in favor of Palestinians. And those who are either philo-Semitic, right? They like Jews affirmatively. They want to connect to the Holocaust. They want to oppose anti-Semitism. They generally tend to be pro-Israeli. But if you look at the fifth one in my list, it's the exact opposite, right? Those who are anti-Muslim in their orientation tend to be pro-Israeli because they see Israel as one of the pieces that fights against the Muslims, right? So it's less that they're pro-Israeli than that they're anti-Palestinian. And they want to support this fight. And of course, those on the flip side who are fighting against the bigotry that Muslims and Arabs face are going to be pro-Palestinian in opposition to those kinds of bigoted responses. And of course, the fourth one on this list are those who support Israel or Palestine for religious motivations, be they the idea in certain versions of Christianity that Israel is needed for Armageddon, the idea in certain versions of Christianity that those who bless the Jews are themselves blessed, the idea that in certain versions of Islam that certain lands that have been conquered by Muslims can never be returned. All of these different ideas sort of sit in the valence of why people who are outside of this 25 million person nucleus of Jews and Palestinians care immensely about this conflict and why it has overtaken the news cycle. All right. The next thing I want to address is the Gazan history to put the situation into context. So we've had a long history of the development of the Palestinian identity, and that identity develops through much of the 20th century. Prior to this, people see themselves as Levantine Arabs without massive differentiation between the Levantine groups. But Palestinian identity comes as a direct result of the changes in the 20th century and for example, the British Divide, the creation of the Mandate of Palestine, the formation of the Arab Higher Committee, which is the first time that an association of Arabs from what is today Israel and Palestine come together and begin to discuss the possibility or the idea that they may be a people. And at the same time, in the 20th century, we see the manifestation of Jewish nationalism, starting with Theodor Herzl's Auf Neuland in 1903, and of course the Balfour Declaration as codified by the San Remo Conference of 1920, which begins to establish the idea of a Jewish national home in the historic homeland of both the Jews and these Palestinians. When the British invade, they are able to establish a mandate, and they call that the Mandate of Palestine. So that mandate exists under British control, with fighting between Jewish and Arab groups throughout the mandatory period. But the British decide to leave the question to the United Nations, and the United Nations divides the territory roughly between a Jewish part and an Arab part. The Jewish representatives widely agree to the proposal, which would have created a Jewish state with a significant Arab minority. Roughly half of the population of the Jewish state would have been Arab, and an Arab majority state with practically no Jews. The Arabs reject this possibility, arguing that as 2/3 of the population, they should be able to be the rulers of the area, and the Jews accept, because this would be the way that in which they would be able to gain territorial sovereignty. And this results in a war that starts in 1947 and continues until 1949, with a part in the middle in May of 1948 where Israel declares independence, and therefore Arab states outside of the region join in the conflict. When those Arab states join into the conflict, the southern part of Israel and Palestine, the part that abuts Egypt, really became what was known as the Southern Front, that the Egyptians controlled and manifested. The Palestinian militias that existed at that time were significantly weaker than anything that the Arab states could put to bear, including what the Egyptians could. So the Egyptians were the ones who effectively defended what is today the Gaza Strip and created that de facto border between Israel after the war in 1949 and occupied Gaza, occupied in this case by Egypt, and the Egyptian state. So once we get to that point, we now have a situation during this war from 47 to 49 where Palestinians have fled in advance of the Israeli armies. Now, there are questions about the degree to which those Palestinians fled because they were ethnically cleansed. They fled because they, on the other side, were pressured to leave by Arab leaders who thought that they could vanquish Israel, and any opinion in between, that they were afraid that something that they heard happened in a different village would happen to their village, so on and so forth. Regardless, between 400 and 500 different Palestinian villages and townships were effectively removed from the territory that would become Israel, and a significant portion of those who fled to the Gaza Strip. In fact, 190,000 people fled to the Gaza Strip. So when Egypt had control of it in 1949, the population was about 30% local and 70% foreign. That is to say, people who had migrated from other parts of the Mandate of Palestine into this strip. That percentage has remained roughly the same today, which is why most Gazans don't even consider themselves Gazans. They consider themselves Japhans or Akrans or somebody from a different part of what is today Israel, because historically they came from there, and they were settled in refugee camps managed by the United Nations Relief Workers Association, UNRWA. And that group built a number of refugee camps for these individuals. At the same time, the United Nations passes Resolution 194, which argues that refugees wishing to return to their homes should do so at the earliest convenient moment. And Israel does not allow the Palestinian refugees to return. At the same time, Jewish populations in Arab countries are expelled, and many of them find home in Israel. And Jews who were displaced from areas occupied by both Egypt and Jordan during the war were not allowed to return to their homes either. Those borders became firm as well. So you end up with this situation where you have in Palestine these massive refugee camps. Now you can see on the right, this is a picture of a refugee camp as it existed. This is Ashata, as it existed in the early 1950s. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is Raha, as it exists about 10 years ago. So when we say that these refugee camps still exist, we should understand that these are actual cities now with concrete buildings, and in some cases, even skyscrapers. But during this period, we have a lot of fighting between Israel and Palestinian groups, where you would have border incursions by what are called fida'i, or attackers who would stream across the border, attack a local village, and then Israel would retaliate by sending military soldiers across the border into Egypt and attacking Palestinian villages there. This also happened on the West Bank side and the border with Syria. And so you had this sort of retaliatory strike always across the border. And so Israel had developed a significant police force alongside its borders in order to manage this situation. Of course, from the Palestinian side, they had no political control. If we're talking about Gaza specifically, they're under the control of Egypt, which is maintaining an incredible political restrictiveness. And this is both during the monarchy period, which ended in 1952, and the Nasserist period, which began in that year. So in the early period, the Egyptians didn't want to foster a sense of Palestinian nationalism. They thought that it would be antithetical to Egyptian designs on the region. That said, they didn't want Jordan, which had annexed the West Bank, in order to claim the entire region for themselves. And so they supported what they called the All-Palestine government, which incorporated a number of members from the Arab Higher Committee, like Amin al-Husseini and Abbas al-Hilmi, into the roles of prime minister and president, respectively. But we should understand that even though this government had a passport, you can see a Palestinian passport that existed from the All-Palestine government, this government had no actual powers. It couldn't collect taxes. It had no militias. It didn't even have a post office that it controlled. So, and these individuals spent more of their time in Cairo than they did in Gaza. What actually ran Gaza was the Egyptian military, and they more or less permitted of course, there were altercations with Israeli soldiers, but they more or less permitted the Israelis to perform these raids into the Palestinian territories in Gaza. Probably the most dangerous of these invasions was against Al-Burayj refugee camp in Gaza, which took place in August of 1953. So the Egyptians were of the view that what the solution to the Palestinian problem should be to settle them in Egypt and create a Sinai agricultural campaign in collusion with UNRWA in order to make this population sedentary and effectively remove them from the board of some kind of Israeli-Palestinian conflagration. We should understand at this point that Nasser's primary opposition was to the British and the French. And since Israel had just launched a war to cut themselves off from British control, Israel could be a possible ally in this war against the British and the French. But the Palestinians made an affirmative choice not to go along with this program. Starting in 1955, they began large-scale protests, arguing that if they were settled to Egypt and Egypt's military state controlled them even more directly within Egypt proper, that they would lose their right of return. And so Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the forerunners of Hamas, and a number of communist groups that were operating in the territory, colluded together and attacked the Egyptian infrastructure in Gaza City in what's called the March Intifada in March of 1955. And this effectively stopped the Egyptians from being interested in relocating this population to Egypt. And this, combined with increasing Israeli discussions with the British and the French in the context of the Suez Crisis in 1956, switched Egypt to being fundamentally anti-Israel and supportive of Palestinian resistance. So during that campaign, Israel actually conquers Gaza, the Suez Crisis in 1956. They actually conquer Gaza for a few months before retreating from this territory under the direction of US President Dwight Eisenhower. And Gaza falls again under Egyptian military occupation after having been under Israeli military occupation for that 1 year. And what Egypt does is they, in 1959, erase the Gaza government, the All-Palestine government, entirely. So the way they do this is through the creation of the United Arab Republic. For those of you who are more familiar with Egyptian and Syrian history, this was a unification of Egypt and Syria, but it was also a unification of Egypt, Gaza, and Syria. And so the Gazan government was unified into this United Arab Republic. And when Syria withdrew in 1961, about roughly 3 years later, right? It started beginning in 1959, ended in the end of 1961. What ended up happening was that Gazan government was fully collapsed into Egyptian military authority. That was overturned when Israel conquered the Gaza Strip in 1967 and put it under Israeli military authority. During this period, the Israelis were dealing with Fatah as the primary organization of Palestinian resistance, which was an Arab nationalist and secularist organization. In order to balance that and to weaken Fatah, they decided to strengthen the Islamist group, Hamas, as a counterbalance to Fatah. And so we see ways in which they tried to strengthen them. For example, they returned weapons caches that they discovered. They permitted the building of the University of Gaza in 1979, which was created by Hamas, and several other low-key decisions to help foment and grow this already existing Islamist organization as a counterweight to Fatah. And when we saw the Camp David Accords, the Egyptians washed their hands of Gaza. They said that it could remain under Israeli military occupation, provided that the Israelis would begin to negotiate some degree of Palestinian autonomy. The Egyptians didn't want to take it back. We then have the Palestinian Intifada. Let's see. The next major change as a result of the Palestinian uprisings called intifadas was that the Israelis decided that the military occupation of Gaza and the settlements that they had created between 1967 and 2005 should be evacuated for Israeli military reasons, not connected to any peace proposal. And so Israel removed this population from Gaza and began to see Gaza as a foreign state controlled at this time by Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority. The next thing that we get to is that between 2005 and 2007, there were elections. And those elections in 2006 resulted in Fatah being roughly defeated by Hamas. Now, Hamas didn't get a complete mandate. They got a partial mandate, and the theory was they should have worked with Fatah. Now, depending on whose account you believe, whether it's Hamas's or Fatah's, Fatah was either unwilling to concede partial power to Hamas, or Hamas was desirous of complete power and the eclipsing of Fatah. Whichever way it went down, it resulted in a civil war that took place in 2006. And that civil war resulted in Hamas taking military control of the Gaza Strip and ejecting Fatah, effectively resulting in two different Palestinian quasi-governments, like a quasi-government in the Gaza Strip and the quasi-government in the West Bank. The one in the West Bank tended to cooperate more with the Israeli authorities, and Hamas, of course, has in its charter an existential desire to remove the state of Israel. And so Israel created a barrier, a large-scale wall, and naval blockade as well, to keep Gaza encircled and prevent Hamas from acquiring the necessary means of war. But also it had the effect of creating a difficult life situation for its internal residents. And so when Hamas took power in 2007, they had to develop all of the state infrastructure that you would need in order to run a country. So you can see, for example, this is a Hamas health ministry awarding doctors in Beit Hanun with regards to their medical care. They develop health ministries, educational ministries, police forces, all the elements of a state. And in fact, many who have been to Gaza have described it as a totalitarian state, very similar to North Korea, in which all power is centralized in the Hamas government, and there is a surveillance state on the population that lives there. And so since Hamas came to power in 2006 until 2022, there's been this sort of de facto situation that exists where Hamas and the right wing in Israel begin to feed into each other, where Hamas will engage in a conflict, and the lists of the conflicts are below, according to their Israeli operational names. And in these conflicts, Hamas will either shoot rockets or attempt a physical attack or a wave of protesters against the Israeli border or what have you, or any kind of attack against Israel, and Israel will retaliate with missiles, aircraft bombings, and the like until the world calls for a ceasefire. And this has happened in several different occasions. But there's one thing that I really want to point to in this period, which is that we develop the understanding that of prisoner swaps and exchanges. Hamas takes a few prisoners. They're able to swap those prisoners for far many more Palestinians in Israeli jails. One in particular is Gilad Shalit, who is an Israeli soldier that Hamas abducted and only returned about a decade later in exchange for over 1,000 different Palestinians in Israeli jails. But for some reason, whether it be internal Gazan politics, whether it be Hamas wanting to try something new, whether they finally figured out how to breach Israeli defenses, whether it was coordination with Russia and Iran, whatever that reason was, Hamas fundamentally changed its style of attack. And so we get to what happened recently. Now, in order to understand some of the context about why it had to happen now, I want to discuss a little bit about the Israeli-Saudi partnership and the Hamas-Iran partnership. All right, so there is a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where each country has sort of had different spheres. And as the United States has withdrawn more and more from the Middle East, these countries have become more and more insistent on creating these coalitions. And so the Iranians are supporting militia groups in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and of course, Hamas became and Iraq, and Hamas became their connection into the Palestine conflict. Conversely, the Saudis see Israel as an effective security guarantor alongside their historic allies in Jordan and Egypt. So this resulted in what was called the Abraham Accords, where the Israeli right, which had largely abandoned negotiating with the Palestinians in favor of negotiating with the Saudis, the Saudi allies and the Gulf Cooperation Council and several other more American-aligned Middle Eastern states made peace with Israel. In fact, you can see here, just before the attack on the 28th of September 2023, Chaim Katz, who was the Israeli foreign minister, was in Riyadh for a historic visit with the Saudi leadership. The possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia was very close in October. And this could have been the impetus for the strike that happened. So let's talk about what actually happened on October 7th. So we have two planners, Mohammed Daif and Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar himself was one of those 1,000 or so 1,000 or so prisoners who were exchanged for Gilad Shalit. And he is one of the earliest founders of Hamas and one of its staunchest proponents. And so it's believed by many that he wanted to create this attack to create more hostages, to free more Palestinians from prison. And this idea has been somewhat borne out by the fact that about a week ago, he promised that he would cease all hostilities and return all of the kidnapped Israelis in exchange for every Palestinian in an Israeli jail. But what actually happened? So in the morning, they breached the Gaza fence. They attacked the Israeli surveillance positions that have been based around the Gaza frontier, which were very lightly armed. Once those positions were overtaken, they began to massacre significant numbers of populations in what's called the Gaza envelope, which is the area of Israel very close to the Gaza border. These attacks continued for about 6 to 12 hours, during which the Israeli military was slowly beginning to retake the area. And as a result, 1,400 people were killed in their homes. In many cases, areas that were known, specifically because Hamas had information from Palestinians who had cross-border permits to work in these areas. They knew the lay of the land relatively well. And then they retreated over the border with roughly 240 kidnapped victims. And so we have to ask, why did the Israeli government not know what was going on here? From a fundamental perspective, the issue comes on several different fronts. The first one is that when the current coalition was assembled in the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, that coalition included a lot of right-wing parties that are concentrated on settlement in the West Bank. And the connection of those parties, like leaders like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was the national security cabinet portfolio from December of 2022 onward, and Bezalel Smotrich, who had the finance portfolio. These individuals and their promotion to the government encouraged more settler activism, let's say, in the West Bank. And that has resulted in violence towards Palestinian populations. One such act was the rampage in Hawara on the 26th of February. And Israeli soldiers had to be deployed in order to keep the settlers apart from the Palestinians. And so you begin to see fewer Israeli soldiers patrolling the Gaza Strip and more Israeli soldiers patrolling the West Bank. This reaches a height in July of 2023 with the Jenin incursion and roughly stays there. On the Gaza Strip position, Israel was primarily using signals intelligence, things like monitoring stations and technology in order to try and contain the Gazans rather than military boots on the ground. And combine this, of course, with the fact that we're on the tail end of the Israeli holiday season. The Jewish holidays tend to fall around September, and this was the last day of the holiday of Sukkot, the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. So many Jews who would have normally been at their military positions were not there, making those positions far easier to overrun, and therefore leading to the much greater success of this atrocity than otherwise could have been if we rolled back the clock to, say, 2021 or 2022. So what has Israel been doing? Israel evacuated the Gaza envelope, and that's that yellow area on the map, and began bombarding the territory starting on October the 7th and October the 8th. Sorry, October the 8th and October the 9th. Those aerial bombardments were followed about a week later by a week and a half later by a ground invasion, where Israel has begun to take parts in the northern part of Gaza and push the population further south, with some questions about whether they should be relocated to Egypt, and of course Egypt refusing, based on partly their experience in 1955 and partly their experience with Gaza. We're going to talk about that in a bit. We also see increasing riots throughout the West Bank, where Israeli soldiers are already deployed, and confrontations that have led to the death of over 150 Palestinians there. In Gaza, over 11,000 Palestinians have died. So what does the Egyptian government and Egyptian military care about this? Well, we've already talked about that in 1955, they tried to relocate Palestinians to Egypt, and the Palestinians refused. We've talked about the Egyptian security state, which has only become more and more restrictive under the rule of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. But even before al-Sisi, there was smuggling between Bedouins in the Sinai, who largely don't have an economy otherwise, and don't have opportunities because the Egyptian state hasn't provided for them, and the government in Gaza. In fact, if you look at the Palestinian clearing sewage from the Rafah smuggling tunnel and look at the date, that was actually during Morsi, who was Muslim Brotherhood, his presidency in Egypt. Even under the Muslim Brotherhood, when Egypt didn't like the Palestinian smuggling between Egypt and Gaza because of the creation of lawlessness in the Sinai Peninsula that wanted to be controlled. And so as early as 2009, under Hosni Mubarak, they had even built a barrier along the Egyptian Gaza border and have been supportive, generally speaking, of the Israeli blockade. And the final point I want to make, and I hear this from a lot of people, is that this could possibly expand into World War III. And I don't find that explanation terribly compelling for several reasons. The first one is Iran doesn't have an effective power of projection to send its military to Israel. It would have to cross Iraq and Syria. And while it can send troops over those distances, they're incredibly vulnerable to Israeli airstrikes, number one. And number two, you have to spend about 5 times the amount to send troops over a distance than on the troops themselves, because you have to take care of the food and the fuel and the medicine and all these other contingents that you use to project power. So Iran might want to do something, but I don't think that they can. Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia don't want to do anything. Egypt is actually quite happy with what's going on in Gaza, the government, not the people, um, because they've hated Hamas since Hamas came into power for all the Sinai reasons I pointed out. So they don't want to get involved. The Jordanians don't want to get involved uh, because their state also has a large Palestinian population, and it could lead to the dethroning of the monarchy if they got involved somehow. The Saudis don't want to get involved because they don't like Hamas either, although they can't say so publicly. The Americans, to the extent that the Americans are interested, don't want to get involved because an American presence in the Middle East is something that the American electorate would not support. And the Russians, regardless of whether they'd like to get involved or not, are busy with something going on in Ukraine, and that's constraining almost all of their military power and potential. So they can't invade or put their finger on the scales beyond weapons transfers, even if they wanted to. So that covers my portion. And sorry for going a little bit over. I hope that was helpful to people. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ralph.
Okay. Okay, hello. I think I'll start with sharing my 2-page slide. Let's see here. Okay. All right. I'll explain about this as I go along. Whatever we may believe about the rights and wrongs of this war, we need to resist reductionism, which is reducing the causes to one thing, ignoring the complexity. We need to be able to hold multiple truths in our heads at the same time. As we observe these events from afar, people are driven into their extreme ideological and ethnic corners. It's become difficult for people to lament the violence and mourn the victims on both sides. I'm a longtime liberal Zionist who supports a two-state solution or a confederation and a negotiated end to Israel's occupation of Palestinian populated territories captured in the 1967 war. I'm co-editor of The Third Narrative, a website that argues for that kind of resolution of the conflict. You can find it at Third Narrative, that is Third Narrative as one word, thirdnarrative.org. And these are a few of recent posts, but I'll get back to that. Israel is in full emergency mode with battles on 3 fronts. 200,000 Israelis were evacuated from their homes in both the north and south of the country, and Israel's counterstrikes have caused a humanitarian catastrophe of the first order in the Gaza Strip. Shocking stories proliferate of loss and suffering among both Israelis and Palestinians. At the same time, violent radical settlers have been allowed to run rampant against innocent Palestinians in the West Bank. This is in line with the privileged position of extremist parties within the current Israeli government. Separately, Israeli forces have been battling violent Palestinian gangs that have been gaining power within West Bank cities. And this includes a new group called the Lion's Den. Over 100, maybe 150 Palestinians have been killed in these battles and settler attacks, with a smaller number of Israelis also killed and injured. Internationally, Jews have been physically threatened and even attacked in some places, signers of pro-Palestinian statements have been threatened with economic consequences. And we know of the terrible murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian American in Illinois. And also, there's been an apparent homicide of a 69-year-old Jewish man in California. I hate the atrocities committed by Hamas and hope for its defeat, while also seeing the agony of over 2 million Gazans under attack in response. Still, those who argue that Gaza has been besieged by Israel ever since Hamas took over there are only half right. Israel has restricted the flow of people in and out and strictly monitored food and other material entering Gaza. Some of these measures seem excessive, but others are justified by Hamas making Gaza into a hostile base and launching pad for attacks. The fact that Israel began its counterattacks with a total shutdown reveals how Hamas, more than once, has bit the hand that feeds its people. I personally know one of the hostages. This is her, Vivian Silver, a 74-year-old peace activist who worked with an Israeli Bedouin partner, shown in this poster that she's displaying, to create an organization for the economic empowerment of Bedouin women. In retirement, she was meeting Gazans at the border and driving them to medical care in Israeli hospitals. Most of the Israelis killed or taken captive were politically left-wing. I largely agree with the perspective of Hussein Ibish. That's here. This is his article. Hussein Ibish is an Arab-American think tank analyst who wrote in the New Republic that, and I'm quoting, by attacking southern Israel and essentially killing or kidnapping everyone they encountered, including Arab Bedouins and Asian laborers, Hamas effectively perpetrated 2 huge massacres. The first of Israelis on the day itself, and the second of the Palestinians being played out on a much grander scale by Israel. Hamas has used aid money to build a network of 300 miles of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, sheltering its fighters and storing huge warehouses of food, water, fuel, medicines that are not provided to assist Gazans. That is, most Gazans. Multiple media sources report that Hamas's operational headquarters is directly underneath Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, now under attack. Yet Hamas wins politically whether Israel attacks and inflicts huge civilian casualties, as it's doing now, or if it holds back, allowing Hamas to continue to operate with impunity and plan new attacks, as their leader has promised they will. This creates a dilemma for Israel attempting to defeat Hamas in its own self-defense. Israel's use of its air force is probably the best way to destroy the Hamas tunnels with the fewest casualties for its own forces. But this clearly creates the most casualties for innocent, non-combatant civilians and exposes Israel to war crime charges that obscure the crimes committed by Hamas on the first day of the war. Instead of genocide, an appropriate historical parallel is the Allied bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan, which killed between 1 and 2 million civilians and destroyed almost all of their cities. There's an ongoing debate as to whether those bombing attacks helped the Allied war effort enough to justify the human cost. Yet, there should be no doubt that the Allies were not simply killing people, but trying to win a war against aggressor regimes that had to be defeated. The same should be understood about what Israel is doing. It must win this war, but is the suffering inflicted on the Palestinians greater than justified for this purpose? And are Israel's attacks creating new generations of Palestinians committed to murdering Israelis? There's growing pressure internationally and from the United States for either a ceasefire or a series of humanitarian pauses. I would prefer the latter if a ceasefire were to leave Hamas in power to attack again. But I believe these pauses should be longer and better targeted than what's happening now. I understand there actually are pauses of a few hours each day. There's long been a de facto unofficial alliance of Israel's pro-occupation right with Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist factions. Let me repeat this. There's actually an unofficial alliance of Israel, well, historically at any rate, of Israel's pro-occupation right with Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists. It's not like they meet and plan things out. It's not that kind of alliance, but both have acted against a negotiated two-state peace between Israel and the Palestinians. In recent years, it's become a de facto alliance between Israel's current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, and Hamas.
Thank you, Ralph.
Whenever Israel, and I still have a page to go, you took 25 minutes,
Okay.
Okay, so I need another few minutes.
All right, I'll give everybody a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Whatever Israel and Palestinian negotiators seem to be moving toward a peace agreement, Hamas and Islamic Jihad have struck with waves of violence against Israeli civilians that have helped the right in Israel to win elections, derailing efforts at peace that had real promise. This has happened at least 3 times in 1996, 2001, and 2009. Netanyahu even owes his first term as prime minister to a wave of terror attacks that killed 60 Israeli civilians in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv during the 1996 election campaign. This erased a 20-point lead that the candidate of the peace camp, Shimon Peres, had until that moment. Fast forward to this past year, Netanyahu's new government thought they could contain Hamas with an economic peace, upping the number of Gazans with permits for day labor in Israel to almost 20,000, and facilitating an influx of funds from Qatar, intended for reconstruction, but instead helping Hamas strengthen its underground fortifications and other preparations for war. What is most galling is that the 70 to 80% of IDF, that is Israeli army active duty soldiers, were serving on the West Bank, protecting settlers there rather than guarding Israel's borders. In fact, the Gaza Border Division of the IDF recently had up to 3/4 of its troops shifted to the West Bank. Until recently, soldiers were stationed in the small border communities that were attacked on October 7th. They were removed after Israel completed its underground wall, meant to block attackers from tunneling into Israel, as they've done previously. There was an over-reliance on technological defenses instead of manned units, sensors, drones, even remotely controlled machine guns. Hamas very carefully planned this operation to defeat them. They seized the IDF's Border Command and Control Center on the first day. The planning was so thorough that maps were found on the bodies of dead Hamas fighters, detailing every house in kibbutzim they overran, with information on who lived there, if there were children, and if they had a dog. It is believed that the intelligence was gathered by some of the day laborers who were taken in as part of Netanyahu's economic peace strategy. It's hard to envision Israel allowing Gazan workers to ever return to those jobs. Almost everyone believes that Netanyahu's long career is finished. Polls show that if an election were held today, his party's representation in parliament would be reduced by 1/3 to 1/2. But elections are probably at least 2 years off, and Netanyahu is a wily politician who has twice before recovered from defeat to return to power. Thanks for listening. Sorry if I ran on too long.
It's all right. We'll give everybody that sort of a little bit. Noorul, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you so much. I think I'll wait for the screen to go away and then I'll start speaking. I will share some slides later on, but right now I'm just going to be speaking for a few minutes, and then let me just time myself also. Just want to make sure that I respect everybody's time. So thank you so much, Richard and Robert, and also Zach, for allowing me to participate in a very sensitive discussion out here today. And let me start off by mentioning some of the very common gaslight propaganda statements people make to justify injustice, actually. This is a manipulation and a distraction. This gaslight propaganda is a very common way of dismantling a credible argument. Let me give you some examples here. So if I say, I want Palestinians to be free, I want illegal occupation to end, I want Palestinians to have equal rights, I want Palestinians to be treated like human beings, the response comes that you are anti-Israel, you are anti-Semitic, you are anti-Jew, or pro-Hamas. When I say that Arabs are Semites too, they say only Jews are Semites. When a Jew says, I'm a Jew and I want Palestinians to be free, they will flag that person as a traitor. This sort of narrative, which favors only one side, which is actually the oppressor, but claims to be the victim, has been witnessed by the whole world silently, and we are kind of seeing a genocide, ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people by an apartheid and a fascist country. This conflict is not a conflict between a Jew or a Muslim. This is for the land of Palestinian people, which includes Spanish Palestinian Muslims and also Palestinian Christians who have been persecuted, besieged, murdered, humiliated, mocked, and denied justice for now 75 years. Another gaslight propaganda moment, which has been happening since the event of October 7th took place, is the rhetorical question to the Muslims and the Palestinian representatives. Do you condemn the action of Hamas on October 7th? This is a very common question that comes across. If I have to respond to that, I would say, let's draw some common sense and parallel, okay? First and foremost, we as human beings should agree that any innocent life lost due to an unjust, deliberate atrocity deserves to be condemned. But I feel the majority of the world has demonstrated bias and hypocrisy with such a stance to condemn Hamas. The context is all in the narrative that we have been fed with. Fair enough. Let's say we condemn the Hamas for its actions. But I want to draw the parallel and say we should also condemn Israel because for 75 years it has been deliberately killed thousands of Palestinians, displaced millions of them at the time of Nakba in 1948, have been violating international laws since then by doing illegal occupation in the West Bank, and where Hamas is not there, by the way, have imprisoned, killed, terrorized, and held hostages in the jail, be it men or women or children or young and old, whoever stood against their oppression were actually put into jail. So where is the outcry and the outrage and the condemnation for all which has been displayed and unfolded since 75 years? So is that fair? Question then? I mean, if Hamas should be condemned, then I would say that Israel should also be condemned. If Hamas is a terrorist organization based on their actions, then Israel also is a terrorist country which considers Palestinians to be human animals and wants to nuke them and be gone permanently. Israel uses Hamas as a scapegoat to kill more Palestinian people. My words are not emotional outrage. I've got evidence for you to confirm the Israel intentions, which I will show you in a bit. I was born and raised in India myself, and I'm living in the United States right now. But we in India had British rule for more than 100 years, and there was no sovereign country, India, at that time. India became India in 1947. But still, people from all faiths and backgrounds came together to fight the British. But anyone who revolted against them and did action which violated their apartheid law, they would call these individuals as terrorists. But to the people of India, they were referred as freedom fighters. Again, comes to the power of narrative. Which side are you on? From Palestinian point of view, Hamas is the resistance in Gaza, just like the PLO is the resistance in the West Bank. People tend to bring the Israeli Arabs living in the Israel as an example of showing solidarity and how democratic Israel is. So Israel is really democratic. Why does it call itself a Jewish state, right? If they why do they have different laws for different individuals? Like Palestinian Muslims have are second-class citizens. In democracy, everyone should be equal, which I don't see that happening in Israel. So I do not consider Israel to be a democratic state. It may be a theocracy or basically a Zionism. The demand of Palestinian people is simple. They say this is their land. It has been taken away forcefully from them and given to the Jews. Before the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there used to be Muslims, Christians, and Jews residing in Palestine in peace and tranquility. Jews claim that this is their promised land mentioned in the Bible, which belongs to their ancestors, and it's rightfully theirs. To give you the context of the history, Jews were not driven out from their promised land by the Muslims. It was the Romans. Everybody knows that. And after so many years, when things changed under different rulers and that became majority of them to be Muslim population living there. So is it acceptable that Jews wholeheartedly they comes back and they want this Palestinian land and they persecute the Palestinian living over there to overtake that particular land? Think about this from a humanistic point of view. Is it fair to uproot people who have resided there for generations after generations, and just because the Jews' promised land, treat the others like the blood of the Jew is more precious than the blood of the Palestinian? So if the Canaanites came today and claimed to be their promised land, would the Jews give up that and move out of there? If the indigenous people, for example, come today and say that American is an ancestral land of them, should I give up my home to them? This is an unjust betrayal of highest degree that was done to the people of Palestine starting from 1917 and then in 1948. And since then, countries like America and France have funded Israel to carry on with the onslaught and ethnic cleansing. Two-state solution is a joke. Neither the Palestinian nor Israelis want that, which is very evident. The future of Gaza and West Bank is very evident, and slowly but surely, either the people of Gaza will be killed or driven out in the sea, and Israel will continue to its illegal occupation in the West Bank with no accountability, and will eventually claim the whole land as one Israel with no trace of Palestinian people and their heritage. Now, relating to the October 7th incident and the aftermath, I have some questions here for the audience to think about. So Hamas launched rockets into Israel. So why did the sophisticated advanced self-defense automation of Iron Dome fail that day? So Israel started bombing Gaza immediately after the attack, and it had carpet bomb hospitals, mosques, and mostly civilians just to kill dozens of Hamas militants. How is it confirming that the militants have died after the bombing has done? And how is it making sure that it is not bombing the hostages, which are with Hamas? So it's very possible that in these bombings that Israel is doing, the hostages might be in that same location. So should Hamas be responsible for that as well? Israel normally gives a 10-minute notification to any apartment or a building to evacuate before they actually bomb that particular place where they suspect for the Hamas militant to be there. So there is a high possibility that Hamas gets aware of that particular notification, and then they might evacuate that location and relocate and recover at a different location. So there is no solution to what they are trying to do, and it's very evident what they want to achieve here. Hamas will not get got rid of that kind of an approach. The most important question for you all to think about is, imagine if Hamas was hiding in multiple locations in any city in Israel. Would Israel bomb the whole city just to kill a bunch of Hamas militants in their own land? The common sense answer will be no. They will not bomb their own buildings. It would take precautionary approach to save its civilian, get rid of Hamas. Then why is it carpet bombing Gaza? This has been the strategy of Israel, to bomb and not to take a precautionary approach. This tells a lot about whose blood is more precious, and they are boasting about it. So I want to mention, I want to basically share my screen now, and I want to show you my presentation here very quickly. I don't know if you can see. So this was from September of 2023, and Netanyahu shows in the UN Conference Assembly the New Middle East, and he actually covers blue for the whole map, including Gaza and the West Bank. Now, this is one of the reasons, obviously the attacks, could have instigated Hamas to do so. Apart from the illegal occupation that has been going on, the Masjid al-Aqsa getting, seized now and then. Every now and then you will see that Masjid al-Aqsa is occupied by the military every now and then. Now, here's a statement from Benjamin Netanyahu from October 28th. Okay. And he states Bible, and he says basically Bible and Torah. And he says from 1 Samuel 15:3, now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both men and women and infant and suckling, oxen, sheep, and camel and ass. So now here's the question. Now, if Hamas uses religion to actually kill people, this is exactly what I'm seeing here. But Benjamin Netanyahu wearing a suit is not called a terrorist. How is that? So that's one thing I want you to understand, is the way people perceive, and the bias here is absolutely disparaging. Israeli Defense Minister, his name is Yoav Gallant. He says, I order a full siege of Gaza Strip, no power, no food, no gas, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly. So human animals. So these individuals, basically people out there are human animals. I'm pretty sure he's not referring to Hamas there. And this is some of the ministers in the Israeli department, and they say that they should be using missiles to wipe out people. I have highlighted this. I don't want to go through all of them because I have very limited time to speak. One particular mention about this individual is Amichai Eliyahu. He says he wants to nuke Israel. And back in the US, there was a vote for ceasefire by Angie Nixon. And she shares a question to the Congress. We are at 10,000 dead Palestinians. How many will be enough? And then Michelle Salzar's responds by saying all of them. And this is happening within the government itself. So think about why this is happening. I'm going to go to this slide here. This is how the progression of the bombing that Israel has done. Apartments have been flattened, and Israel claims that it's not doing carpet bombing. This is exactly what carpet bombing looks like, by the way. And then you have 25 journalists already killed, so many doctors also killed. And US, my own tax dollars, is fed to conduct all this, which is happening in Gaza. Now, the narrative of Hamas killing the civilians out there on October 7th, there is a lot of questioning going on over there, because earlier they were saying that they were beheaded babies. There were also rape charges as well for Hamas fighters, so the claims that people are retreating now, like earlier they were saying that there was 1,400 victims, now it's 1,200 victims. So that narrative is changing. So why should we trust that is everything that Israel says? And this is one particular woman. She was in kibbutz when Hamas attacked. Her name is Yasmin Porat, and she says that Israeli forces shot their own civilians. So this is out there for you to read on Google it. You can Google it, Israel can conduct their own civilian casualties in order to make it look like Hamas did it. I just want to stop there and then maybe continue in the Q&A, because I want to give that. I think I spoke for like 14 minutes. Thank you so much for the time.
All right, so Aaron, this is your presentation.
Yeah, so Richard, I'd like to do, I think, more of a Q&A, because we haven't had a lot of audience participation so far. So maybe we, after 3-4 speakers at this point, we can start taking some questions, because we have a pretty sizable audience, and I'm sure they have quite a few questions.
I would say that the one question that we really have is, I've seen and heard people refer to them as Zionist, and what does that term mean in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship? And I think, Aaron, you can also add to this, as well as Ralph, but I think at a fundamental level, you have two different definitions of Zionist that sort of circulate in the universe. The first one is usually used by Jews and Israel supporters more broadly to refer to anybody who sees as valid the idea that there should be a Jewish-run state in the area that has territorially been called Palestine, or the land of Israel, right? That such an entity should exist. And there's the second definition that sort of exists, that's used generally by those who are detractors towards that project, and will argue that it is referring specifically to those who believe that that state should be exclusionary in some aspect, right? It should either not include Palestinian Muslims and Christians, or Palestinian Muslims and Christians, to the extent that they have a state, that should be controlled somehow by Israel, either lack of defensive capability, lack of importation capability, something like that, right? So those are sort of the two definitions of Zionist. Typically, when I use the term, I use it in the former category. Yeah. But does anybody else want to add to that?
I mean, I would say, I think, and I know you covered this in your Great MENA series, the fact that there is a 19th century version of Zionism, and then I would say there's a let's say 1930s, 40s version, and then there's a 50s, 60s, 70s, and then you could maybe glue those together and say that there's a sort of lasting legacy version that is not really well organized in any legitimate sense from a philosophical standpoint. I mean, you have very small academic and or proto, ethno-religious group definitions, but I don't think outside of sort of media landscape and people who define themselves in those terms, most people don't walk around and suggest that's what they are, or that's what they emphasize their daily project is. I mean, there's just a small, fairly small group that does that. You might say they have at times outsize capacity to influence different media arguments, but I think there's an argument there that's just a lot of times media looking for conflictual sides in larger extremes in terms of arguments. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about that, or anyone else does, because that's how I sort of see those movements into the modern both Israeli state, and then I would also say in how the modern Palestinian state or non-state functions, or statelets in essence function with the Israeli government. They're not really operating an anti-Zionist campaign. That's more of a sort of a figurative narrative versus the concrete nature of Israel as a state, very much like any other conflictual zone, whether it's Azerbaijan and Armenia or Georgia and Abkhazia, et cetera. I don't know if you want to go into further detail there, just sort of where that clouding of narrative meets sort of state action.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something. Having participated in the Zionist movement since 1982 and having attended several World Zionist Congresses, I think I'm kind of qualified. Zionism is not really a coherent ideology. It's not one thing. It's really kind of a platform, and you have a spectrum of views within that platform. I happen to be on the platform that's on the left part of that spectrum, and what is done by the current government, which is very right-wing in the name of Zionism, is an embarrassment and in a lot of ways a disgrace. And I think it undermines Israel in many ways, not only because of its incompetence, but because of its, these kind of disgraceful statements that are made by leaders of the sort that the previous speaker mentioned. And the movement that I have embraced when it was founded believed very much in a binational state, and that's what they advocated. And in recent decades, they've been very strong in terms of supporting a two-state solution with Israel living in peace side by side with a Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip, most of the West Bank, and part of what is East Jerusalem today. And there are various gradations in between. But it should be understood that however we view Zionism, when you make tirades against Zionism, what you're really talking about is a country, and a lot of times violent Palestinian fighters have exulted in killing Zionists when they really were doing was killing Israelis. Usually more civilians than soldiers, usually. That's an issue. But anyway, I for one, would be very happy if Zionism were retired as a term. It's something that Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, even hinted at. He says Zionism has basically been achieved. The Zionist goal has basically been achieved by the creation of Israel. Even the notion of Israel as a Jewish state it's a bad translation. Herzl really was talking about a state for the Jews, and it didn't mean it to mean only for the Jews, but it meant that for Jews to defend themselves in the 20th century with this growing anti-Semitic movement. And anti-Semitism was not about a language group which includes Arabs and Hebrew speakers. It was an invention of these right-wing ultra-nationalist Europeans who were very clear that they were targeting Jews. Anyway, there's a lot more I could say, and I simply will shut up now and go on with the program. Thank you.
So, anyways, Richard, you're muted. I didn't know if you wanted to go into any of the military operation pieces, or you just
so let's do that. So,
Sure.
Sorry, let me get to your slides.
Okay.
There you go. This was your first slide. Do you want to do this, or you want to do this?
So I think the initial attacks. I mean, I would recommend that people go out to Wikipedia. They've done I think a pretty good job in breaking down the chronology and timeline. I did put a link into the chat on that so that people can see, if they're so interested, sort of the mechanics of how the attacks worked from October 7th, from the initial wave of attacks. I do believe, it's important to understand that this was a substantial escalation over the traditional attack vectors that Hamas has had, really going back even through the first and second Intifada. And you could make an argument some of that boiled down to means. I would say it was generally constraints by Hamas leadership, and also the idea of coordination. And I do think this is something that is not really discussed, is that, and I know you have in a prior MENA presentation, Richard, is that there isn't this grand alliance operating between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, overall Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iran, because they operate off of, number one, different philosophies, number two, different geographical centers. And given how Gaza has been, in essence, completely reconstructed as really a statelet, which is very different than the West Bank, right? The West Bank is, even with a massive shift in settlements in the last 25 years, it is far more, I would say, co-integrated. It's not integrated, but it's co-integrated, where there's much more shared infrastructure. There's much more, and I'm not sanctifying it. I'm just pointing out sort of the facts, and the way that different resistance operations exist in West Bank is radically different than in Gaza, and the constraints on those operations. And I would also say that there's more of a franchise model than Hamas has, right? So, people might not fully appreciate how, let's say, an organization like Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad is structured, where there really is franchise operations. So there is an Islamic Jihad in Hamas. It's not integrated into Lebanon Islamic Jihad. It's, at times had, let's say minimal integration into the West Bank Islamic Jihad, into the, let's say, Hezbollah franchise. And then obviously there's the Syrian version, which since the Syrian civil war, has in some ways almost 1.5 versions of Islamic Jihad. And that's just the Islamic Jihad, thread, right? You have a Hezbollah thread like that. That's not quite as fragmented, but it has a very similar fragmentation. And the reason this is important is that this idea that there's this sort of joystick from Iran that, push left, push right, that these things happen, is just really not the case. Now, Iran, and more importantly, when we say Iran, what do we really mean? Well, it's really the Iranian Guards Corps. And within that, there's their factionalization, which after decades of being involved in these conflicts, you could make a very fair argument that in some ways, many of those have retired to go native, right? So they have, in some ways, their own franchises also in the field. And we have to recognize that given Hamas's evolution the last 40 years, which really comes more from the Muslim Brotherhood strain, which of course runs, quite philosophically counter to Iranian both political, economic, religious influences. And in some ways, it's a much larger philosophical conflict there between Egypt and Iran, and especially amongst, Muslim Brotherhood. So, this idea that there's this sort of globally staged plan, I just think is just not very real. I think even with Hamas, and I don't think we will know this for quite a while, or it will be released. I think that it was a very concerted effort by a very large minority militancy within Hamas that took this operation on, and versus a fully coordinated across Gaza type operation. And a couple points I think make this clear is that there was roughly 60 or so incursion sites in the attack, but the amount of personnel that went through, and also the sort of opportunistic kind of grab bag, people on the street saying, the heck with it, let me roll, was quite high. Which, if you were conducting a very coordinated operation, you wouldn't allow that type of sort of opportunistic incursion. And I think you can make an argument that they really didn't have a plan beyond, proving they could attack the automated security that Ralph was pointing out. They could penetrate through these incursion zones, grab hostages, and I think sort of lost control. I don't even know if they had control of various militant sort of groups and gangs that they activated that morning. And in many cases, they activated them that morning, and they really triggered a historic crisis in Hamas at this point, because this has triggered an enormous, really a disproportionate response to meet the same disproportionate attack vector that Hamas had. Because if you look at the highest civilian casualties prior, I want to say it was, you'll correct me, Richard, but I think it was 2004, the triple bus bombing, which I think was 74. And this was, well over an order of magnitude, maybe order and a half magnitude, of an attack. And, they also so it's almost like this was like 10 attacks. There was the Iron Dome saturation attack, which Saeed pointed out, which, in some ways, a lot of the U.S. response to this, which I don't think is fully appreciated either, is, when sending the 2 battle carrier groups, is to reinforce the Israeli Iron Dome because the basic technology, the Iron Dome, is based on the Aegis a defense system, which was originally a sea-based defense system to protect a battle carrier group, which the Israelis have basically re-engineered to make it land-based, sea-based, and they built their own air-based one that is, let's say semi-complete at this point. And so the objective by Hamas was a saturation attack, which, this attack in the first 30 minutes fired around 2,000 ballistic propulsion fires. That means a missile or a rocket. That's the largest ballistic propulsion attack in human history. There's never been 3,000 or 2,000 plus 2,200 rockets and missiles fired in a matter of about 20 or so minutes. So that by itself was a substantial escalation. But it was also uncoordinated, because if, for those that understand, Hezbollah has, let's say somewhere between 15 and 20,000 rockets and missiles. Hamas has 15 to 20,000 rockets or missiles. Hezbollah has 10 times that, at least. And so, if the goal was a true saturation, then Hezbollah would have participated in that. And really all that happened is they sort of responded, very local militias fired off a few dozen. I think in the total, there's only been about 400, 500, which is, large, but spread over a course of, 5 to 10 days. But I also think that, Hezbollah understands that if they launched, what would be a saturation of tens of thousands, that would trigger a radical response by the Israelis, not just against Hezbollah West Bank, but against Hezbollah Lebanon, and likely Hezbollah Syria, et cetera. And Hezbollah doesn't want those costs right now. It doesn't make sense for its strategies that it has, and obviously Iranian strategies of from the Guards Corps. So I think we should try to understand this attack as being so unique within the framework of who Hamas is as a political actor in Gaza, and how they, ultimately operate like a junta, given the results of the 06-07 election cycle and their civil war with Fatah, which, kept them in charge, and they haven't had any elections since then. And I doubt they ever will have elections. And they've basically stated that it's not their job to provide not just humanitarian relief, but just operating government in Gaza. It's to maintain a resistance conflict. So to me, that
if we could pivot, Aaron,
Yep,
could
sure.
you talk a little bit about what's going on in the area of bombardment? Like what is
Sure.
the Israeli thought process in
Yeah,
what's
so-
going on in Gaza?
I think Saeed and others have pointed out, in essence, that this attack by Hamas, the Israelis were completely unprepared, and you could argue they were in a lulled state of sort of basic operations. And when a state confronts something like that, especially an adjacent state, generally the only thing they have to do that is the least cost, and I'm taking kind of IR positions here around costs, is launching airstrikes. And basically what the Israelis have done is launch roughly somewhere around 10 to 15,000 airstrikes, which the last time you had this kind of sortie count was the first Gulf War in 1990. And so the difference now is, and Saeed pointed this out, is that, you really did have an aerial bombing campaign. I mean, there was targeting incorporated in the aerial bombing campaign, but ultimately, when you look at rubble, it's an aerial bombing campaign. And I believe that is more of a political response and a targeting of Hamas at the same time. But if your goal is to actually have a large-scale incursion, which is what which is what the IDF has at this point, one of the things you probably wouldn't want to do, especially if it was in a very large urban dense area, is to construct, basically penultimate defensive positions, which you then have to clear and it's not a video game, right? So, rubble doesn't stay neatly on each side of the street. So you now have, complete street and grids that are completely rubbled, which that means you have to clear them. To clear them, you need to have, in essence, engineering forces, which is very slow and makes you a very easy target. And you now need larger force protection. So you sort of construct your own problem in urban warfare. But I think the combination of lack of readiness, incoherence, a lack of a strategy, or conflicted strategies within IDF, given the initial response, the Netanyahu government basically said, "Hey, let's pull out Go Plan 15 or whatever it was, and just hammer as many targets as we see," which obviously drove huge Palestinian casualties, 10,000 plus killed, and we don't really talk about in these kind of conflicts how many people were wounded, the degree and severity of wounded, and then obviously the cost that has in terms of medical care and the difficulty in evacuating somebody. So there was a fundamentally incoherent initial response. I believe now the IDF is, I'd say, fully in charge. And now they're going to, in essence, prosecute their incursion. I believe its primary target's Gaza City. And I had an example. The last scale example of this is Badr City Battle. If any of you remember that, probably most don't, in 2008 during the Iraq War. And Sadr City, I think, represents, let's say about a 25% mock-up of what Gaza City is in relative terms. The big difference is Sadr City did not have anywhere near the tunneling system that Gaza City has, much less all of Gaza, but especially Gaza City. And in modern warfare, this represents a true third dimension, and the concept of subterranean fight, which is completely novel. I mean, it really is. Not that there hasn't been people fighting in tunneled environments for, hundreds of years back to, maybe close to 1,000 years. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a complete subterranean environment that's the size, maybe not the diameter, but the size of maybe the New York City subway system. And it's really a parallel Gaza City, which is obviously administered by Hamas and its administration, both for political, economic, military, almost every aspect of administration. And if Israeli war aims are destroy Hamas, right? That's a very broad war aim because that's both a concept, but also militarily, that is a population that's quite large, versus what I believe is the more pragmatic war aim was always to eliminate a first strike capability that mirrored anything like that was seen on October 7th. Which I think was far more attainable. But now they've bought into a large war aim, I'd say their version of invasion of Iraq, which would involve, I think, a force that would be at least as large as they have in reserve. And of course, when they called up the reserves, they didn't call up the reserves for all of Gaza. This was called up for all three, really four areas that they have to defend, which is Gaza, West Bank, and the North, Golan Heights, and Northern Israel, plus the central Israeli areas think of it as a quick response force or as a supported force. And so you're really splitting that 350,000, 300 plus thousand reserve call up. So you have maybe 125,000 that are in Gaza right now. They're surrounding Gaza. Now, for the Sadr City campaign, the U.S. had about 30,000 combat arms, about 25 to 30,000 support forces, and the Iraqis had about 100,000 that were mixed between Iraqi army, Iraqi National Police, Iraqi support forces, etc. And that campaign took several months. It also involves some novelties, like putting up a large 3 mile barrier, 10 feet high, which look to cut off the city and build basically a defense in depth, which I think the Israelis are trying to figure out how to do one of those on the cheap. But I think one of the problems they run into is I believe they would need at least another 100,000 forces minimum. And
all right, thank you, Aaron.
3 to 6, 9
yeah.
more months.
So our last speaker, Greg.
Okay, I'll try to be short. I understand we need to round it up. So just very quickly, since the beginning of the war with Ukraine and Russia, and I just want to talk about this situation from Russian perspective, there was rise of anti-Semitism. There were some comments, especially from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, of anti-Semitic nature, public comments, and Soviet Union and Russia now continuing been taken position to support Arab side versus United States supporting Israel. There were a lot of conversation in Russian media about that Putin had a hand in instigating this somehow, maybe through Iran or anything else, but certainly there is no hard evidence for that. But maybe it was based mostly on the motives. So Russia officially does not consider Hamas as a terrorist organization. So, and therefore, as we see on this slide, thank you, Richard, they, on October 26, they had a meeting, Putin had a meeting with representatives of Hamas. You see the Abu Marzouk, Musa Abu Marzouk on the right side. He is a member of Hamas leadership. He came with a visit to Moscow and an official, meeting with Putin. So that's kind of demonstrating Russian support for Hamas. And the other interesting event is it's on the right side, that really unprecedented event that in the region called Dagestan, which is you may know is right next to the Chechen autonomy. In the city of Makhachkala, which is the major port on the northwestern part of the Caspian Sea, there was kind of through internet instigated the story that there is an the airplane from Israel landed in Makhachkala, supposedly carrying Israeli refugees wanting to settle there in Makhachkala, and it gathered a mob of approximately 1,500 people that went onto the airport to kill Jews with, as you could see, Palestinian flags and anti-Semitic slogans. So they first they started to check all the cars and buses coming out of the airport and checking all the documents there to see if they could catch some Jews. They were actually clearly were in a murderous mood. And eventually they descended on the airport itself and went even into they completely overwhelmed it. It looks like the security didn't try to intervene. And they went onto the airplane. There was an airplane that made a fueling stop from Israel, a fueling stop at Makhachkala to continue maybe somewhere else. And they went to the airplane, and the pilot they announced that the people should not open the door and get out from the airplane because there is a danger. There's an angry mob outside, so airplane was not open. So as a result, they were running, looking for Jews to kill them. As a result, there are like maybe 20 people suffered. Nobody got killed, but there are a couple of very serious injuries. Well, anyway, this is, really amazing event. There was a lot of discussions that there is only one road leading to the airport and could be easily be prevented. So a lot of people were saying that the government kind of allowed this to happen because this is a strategic object of a major port in the Caspian Sea. So these are the events that are happening in Russia with regards to this and Russian position. And that's basically all I want to, for the sake of saving time for maybe discussions and questions, I don't want to go into any other parts of it. Thank you.
That's great. We actually have a few questions. So one of those is, there's been a lot said about the strength of Israel's security and defenses, and that there's a failure of those defenses as pertains to the attack. So why is this failure being highlighted so much? And I think I'll start and others can finish if they feel it's helpful. At a fundamental level, Israel was perceived in much of the Middle East as being more or less invincible after the 4 Arab-Israeli wars, right? 48, 56, 67, and 73. And that era of invincibility got shattered somewhat in the Lebanese civil war, and it got shattered somewhat in the war with Hezbollah in 2006. But by and large, the fact that Israel is a very effective military served as a deterrent and a protection for the state of Israel, and created this sort of sense that Israel was able to repel any attack, and also that Mossad, its intelligence agency, was incredibly effective. And so the fact that it is so effective, and the party that attacked Israel was one that Israel was familiar, was one that was operating antithetical to its interests. It's not as if Israel was unaware that Hamas had negative attitudes towards it or had tried to attack it in the past. This should have been, from the perspective of intelligence, a relatively easy situation to diffuse. It wasn't, though. Right. This was a situation where the automated systems were taken offline, to the extent that there were physical humans that were protecting Israeli civilians in the Gaza envelope. Those people were taken offline relatively quickly, either kidnapped or killed within the first hour. So, and the Israeli response was incredibly delayed. The country of Israel is not very large, and there are numerous different depots and military garrisons throughout the country. So the fact that it didn't respond is in fact very surprising, and that's why it's often highlighted that this was a massive failure. Are there others who want to contribute to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say clearly going forward, you're not going to see, regardless of what government exists in Israel, not having large-scale regional QRFs, basically quick response forces, that will be active permanently, which is a very high cost, right? And so that is one of the dimensions of this that Hamas has, or at least this militant subgroup within Hamas has generated, is this will put in place permanently, regardless of what happens over the next year in Gaza, which I believe will be a year. There will be a forever QRF that is within 10 kilometers, whatever, of each of the north, the west. I mean the north, the south, and the east. And it's not as simple as there will be one QRF, right? This will probably be a dozen or two, and they have multiple shifts. And I mean, this is going to be a substantial shift in how Israel is developed as a defense state. And I do think, and one quick point that I think is important is that since the 79 agreement, basically Israel has, part of the benefits they had to that agreement is, in essence, Israel was able to take offline to the reserves large-scale conventional forces. and then given how the first Intifada, well, the pre-Intifada, which is like Intifada 0, or a whole bunch of them, and then Intifada 1, 2, eventually 3, formed, Israel really, for 40 years, became more of a counterinsurgency security state, even though they had in Lebanon in 82 and then again in 2000, et cetera, various conventional Lebanese conflicts, which resulted because they could plan and they can reserve up those forces over a course of months and years. They really stopped being a conventional active duty combat power. And this conflict now in Gaza, with Hamas, is going to have to reorient Israel's defense, because what they really did, if we're going to be honest, is they used their Air Force as a means of a large-scale conventional force. And that, whether that worked or not, it's debatable, which means it probably didn't very effectively, if you can debate it, because they didn't want to take on the cost. It's extremely expensive to keep armored and mechanized brigades and divisions sitting around training and being effective. You see this across the whole Middle East, really, where no state wants to do this. Some of it is sort of geographical logistics. It doesn't make sense, right? I don't think Saudi Arabia at this point feels that they are going to be threatened by the Iraqis or the Kuwaitis in that way, or Yemenis or anyone else, as even Iran, which could in theory feel that there is, threats out there from whether it's Israel, US, the usual suspects.
More likely.
Yeah, I mean, they don't sit there and believe there's going to be a large scale conventional symmetrical land war going into Iran. So Israel really, in some ways, just became another Middle East a defensive state. But the unique nature of Gaza as a constructed statelet that was completely isolated, and the lull that was developed, which I think was a combination of a perfect storm of Israeli sort of misreading of things and incompetence, poor intelligence, bad luck, and I'd say within Hamas, probably fragmentary conflict of approaches, which when you read it from the outside says, oh, well, obviously they're not going to launch some large scale attack that will radically change the calculus in the whole Middle East. So I think all those together allowed Israel to have another version of a sort of 67, 73 kind of psychosis. And that's going to change forever at this point. I just think and realize this is going to mean higher taxes. This is going to be a very different political environment that I do think is going to shift Israeli politics going forward.
I think that's actually a really great point to pivot to another question that we've had. To what extent are Netanyahu's previous crimes, corruption and so on, and any crimes that he commits during the invasion of Gaza, to what extent will they be prosecuted? And to what extent will those in his cabinet who may be responsible or somehow contribute to it, is there any way that they might be held responsible? I think, Ralph, this is a question for you.
There's very likely to be a high-level investigation, and Israelis do believe that Netanyahu is finished, as I mentioned. He is under more than indictment right now for these corruption charges that he's on trial. And, I find it quite baffling as to why this trial keeps on going and, when it's going to come to a resolution. So we're waiting for some consequence from that. But I want to point out the poignancy of the fact that this attack of October 7th happened almost to the day of the 50th anniversary of the start of the 1973 war, which was also launched on a Jewish holiday, on Yom Kippur, the most holy of Jewish holidays. What the two wars have in common is that Israel was suffering under what was called the conception in 1973 that the Arab states had no military option at that time. That 1967 was such a decisive victory, they had no option. And that was proven wrong. And today, previous to October 7th, Israel was under the misconception that the Palestinians had no real major violent option. I mean, they could, as they have all along, stage attacks, usually against Israeli civilians, but that the Palestinians did not represent a challenge to the existence of the state of Israel. And, many, if not most, Israelis now believe that they do represent a challenge, which is to Israel's existence, which is why they're pursuing this attack on Gaza with such vehemence. We'll see. We'll see what happens with Netanyahu. But polling data shows that he really is finished. Even people within his own party are talking about replacing him. That's another consequence of this war. If anything, that would be a good consequence of this war.
Yeah. One quick point here, Ralph. I think you're making some great points. Is that the government right now has not sold this as a long war to the Israeli population. They've sold it as a retributive sort of response. But we all pretty much know in politics, and you can maybe attenuate that to some degree in the Middle East, that can stretch a little longer. But eventually, if someone believes there's a retributive response, regardless of how fair or not it is, generally they're not signing up for a 1 year or 3 year retributive response, right? It's just there's really no politics anywhere that really sells very effectively, maybe in a full junta state. But one of the challenges I think they have, or when I say they, I mean the Netanyahu government, is that basically there's a time lock on this. I think it's probably 60 days. And at that point, this turns into a large scale managed IDF operation, and we'll call it the political side of trying to joystick this, right? Where, Netanyahu, if you've noticed, has taken on his Zelensky kind of like nom gajor, where he's wearing his all black. I don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature. But at a certain point, once this is a full scale IDF operation, the necessity of the Netanyahu government as sort of the ones dictating this, I think, drops dramatically. And right. I could see, especially as you go into this becoming more of a 6 month to a year or multi-year operation, that there will be a pretty radical shift in politics, probably starting somewhere between day 90 and day 270. And a lot of those collisions that Ralph and Richard have talked about with the court system, with prosecution of Netanyahu, with his family, et cetera, and then all the coalitional politics around him really start falling apart. And
Yeah.
and
So
the ability to sort of segregate these two things becomes sort of fundamental in Israeli politics. I can easily see that within 6 months.
we have a question actually for Noorul. Um, First of all, thank you for addressing us and speaking so calmly about a situation that has affected your people so disproportionately. Obviously, the current situation is one where both parties live in constant fear of one another. It is this fear that drives disproportionately bad behavior on both sides. So, what advice would you give to Israelis and world Jewry to view the Palestinians and Muslims with more humanity? And conversely, what advice would you give to Palestinians and the Arabs to deal with more humanity with respect to the others?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So obviously, our discussion here, Richard organizing it, really appreciate that. Our discussions are not going to solve the problem. We don't represent anybody in the government at all. And whatever we speak is basically what we feel is happening, right? It's our own opinions, and it's not going to change anything. So if you ask me about, my personal view of how should things be dealt with, I'm a programmer. I do development work. I work in IT. And when an issue happens, when a production failure happens, we always do a root cause analysis. And I believe we are asking the wrong questions, basically. The question should be, why is this all happening? Why? And I believe that the answer to all that will be and the solution also will be in the history. Now, Israel has the right to defend itself. It has, unleashed an annihilation of atrocities on innocent civilians out there. I don't believe that anybody from the government Israel will be given an accountability, and there will be no consequences or prosecution of those officials. It will never happen. This is what I believe, because if you see in the past, America has killed more people using the lie of weapons of mass destruction. It will continue to happen. This is historically done by people who are in power, who are superpowers out there. And Israel is a watchdog of America in the Middle East. So there will be no prosecution. No one will be held accountable. The solution is basically to go back to ask Palestinians what do they want, right? And that they will respond to you. And obviously the answer is they want their land back. That's basically the solution to this whole conflict going on. Now, Israel has taken the opportunity in 1948 to form their own state, but the Palestinian people don't accept it, and that's why they are kind of resisting it, and they will continue to resist it. It is just like a normal human reaction. Their land is taken away, their rights have been taken away. They are besieged. They are kind of in open prison in Gaza right now with no accessible human things available to them. So they are reacting just because of lack of humane things restricted to them. And even though the technology and advancement of technology will continue to happen, but the resistance will continue. They will try to do some kind of infiltration to fight back, and this is how all happened in the history. It will continue to happen in the history. The people are calling for ceasefire. I say that ceasefire is like you are calling like a woman is getting raped, and you are actually asking the rapist to time out for a few hours, and then continue the rape again after that. So this is really unfortunate that the situation is like that. And obviously the solution, my opinion, personal opinion, is to go back and give the land back to the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, there's another question that's come up here in sort of two different formulations, and I think this is really a question for Aaron regarding the parallels between the battles that Israel might be facing in the Hamas tunnels and the battles that the Americans fought against the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And the Americans, by and large, didn't win in Vietnam against the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were incredibly successful in moving around those tunnels, and the Americans weren't. Can you clarify what would make this situation different, or do you see this as a similar situation in that Israel can't actually go through the tunnels and achieve its aim of destroying Hamas, even assuming that, you can take care of all the other issues in the conflict?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's something that's been highlighted the last month, is the robust tunnel system, or basically the parallel Gaza City and also into parts of southern Gaza. I think it's important to segregate the difference. Gaza City tunnels are much more like urban tunnels that people would be familiar with, maybe not as large. Some cases they are, but it's more of a subterranean network. Whereas when you leave Gaza City and if you go to the other cities, they'll have their own mini versions of the Gaza City tunnel system. But as you leave those cities, you have more of a rural cache storage network approach to tunneling. So that's really different types of tunnels, right? And so it's important to understand that classification, because the approaches will be radically different. I think the number one reason Israel will not be able to fully deal with these tunnels is they don't want to pay the price, right? The cost of a large scale detunneling process in Gaza City would probably take several years. Probably cost somewhere in the order at least thousands, if not low tens of thousands, if you count all casualties, tens of thousands of Israeli IDF forces. It will, parallel, right? So you run into this, remember, it's three-dimensional. You run into this parallelization issue that I think nobody is really discussing. So when you have a built-up city and you have a subterranean city, right? You have buildings that you fight, you have streets that you fight, and you have underground that you fight. You really don't want to move too far away in each one of those dimensions. That forces a pretty expensive synchronization challenge, especially on the attacker. Generally speaking, the attackers succeed, right? I think one of the narratives that's been sort of overplayed preparing for this in the last month is that this is a slam dunk for defenders, right? If you look at the largest set of examples we have of these fights, which is World War II, whether it was the Philippines or Singapore or other places in the East, or whether it was pretty much across all the cities in the Western Front, there's not one of those cities that eventually didn't fall. And if you look at the modern versions of those, it's pretty similar. The issue is the cost that you're willing to sustain in the attack. And I think that's really the challenge the IDF has, is they're looking to do this on the cheap, as anyone would. But that allows time. I mean, that's a time issue, right? And the longer you give Hamas, the more they can set up robust defenses, which I think their defensive strategy isn't going to be radical. It's going to be a fusion of what we've seen in Ukraine with what we've seen be effective in the Middle East, which is basically coordinating small rocket and mortar fire onto, think of them as sort of kill zones in the middle of 4 streets with IEDs, and setting up these complex ambushes. I have one slide there, Richard, if you want to pull it up. I think it would be good for people to see. And this isn't super secret information, right? This is anyone that's ever served in the military or been around combat arms or has any interest in it from any side, anywhere in the world. What they're basically going to do is wait until, and they're already doing this, a larger force comes in, you hit pieces of those forces, which then requires evacuation, and then you hit parts of the evacuation. And so you create this sort of chain link effect in a complex ambush. And then that forces overwhelming force by the attacker to protect it all, but that immediately shuts down the advance. And you just keep doing this over and over and over again. And then that delays this. And remember, the difference here is that's what you do on land. you start having the same challenge in buildings where you're taking a building over, drawing fire from other buildings, hitting that building, but not so destroying that building because you want to leapfrog to that building, right? So you're not calling in airstrikes, right? So this is the whole problem with the airstrike thesis, is it just doesn't work when you get into one of these complex urban engagements. And one aspect, and I'd like everyone to follow this if they could, and it's really fundamental, is Israel was never designing itself for this big urban fight. And the one measure of that is the critical resource you need outside of conventional large-scale forces to go and take a city is you need armored gunships. And Israel only has 44 Apache gunships, which in the real world, you don't fly all 44. It's not a video game at the same time, right? They're recycling, they require X number of hours, eventually days, to get reconditioned and maintained for every few hours of flight. So eventually you're only keeping 6 or 8 of these up at a time. And that becomes a constraint on the areas that you can target within, or else you're going without the air cover that you need. And traditional fixed wing Air Force is not a good supplement for that. It's way too broad in very dense areas. The concept of sort of danger zone shooting at your own friendly force kicks into gear. So this is an advantage Hamas has. Now, when I say it's an advantage, it's not an advantage to win. It's an advantage to create a very, very expensive political, economic, and military cost on Israel. And I think Hamas's bet, which I don't think is a bad bet right now, is that Israel has not sold a long war to the Israeli population. And do not underestimate having 500,000 Israelis taken out of the workforce in their 20s and 30s, which are, the most productive people in any society, typically, most educated, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's a big cost. That's a GDP hit. That's not a trivial GDP hit. That's in percentage points to maybe up to 10%, which has to be funded by taxes and the way you go. So
we have another question. This one's directed towards Greg. The Soviet Union was a huge implementer in decolonization theory and the ideas behind the sort of the rise of the third world and these sort of ideas. To what extent is Russia trying to reclaim this? To what extent is Russia trying to grow with these theories, or is Russia trying to abandon that, like it's trying to abandon a lot of issues of Soviet legacy? Can you sort of walk through sort of the thought process in Russia about where they stand on this conflict and where they stand on that historic relationship towards decolonization theory?
I think Russia is trying to rebuild a lot of influence that it has lost since collapse of the Soviet Union, and especially in the Middle East and among the Arab world. I mean, like clearly it was demonstrated by Russian involvement in the Syrian war in support of Assad, where they were quite successful. So, yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard because decolonization theory is basically dividing oppressors and oppressed people. So I don't know, they're fully trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union policies, but they certainly want to be in the center stage of world politics, and they want to regain as much of influence as possible. And they do have expansionist tendencies. That's, I think, pretty clear.
Yeah. All right. I mean, we've gotten a few comments, but most of the comments are, in my view, a little overly simplistic. You can sort of get those from mainstream media. Are there any questions that the panelists have for each other? Anything that they'd like to hear a different panelist talk about?
I'd like to ask Noorul what he thinks that 7 to 8 million Israeli Jews should be doing if, as he says, the Palestinian people should simply take back what is now the state of Israel, and Israel will no longer exist. Not to mention the 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who, although one can say are second-class citizens, have more political rights in Israel than Arab citizens generally do in other countries, in Arab countries. But really, what are 7 to 8 million Israeli Jews supposed to do? Where are they supposed to go? Should half of them who came from Arab and other Muslim countries go when they were thrown out of there? Should they go back to where they were thrown out from? I mean, what's his solution?
Well, like I said, we should go back to the history. So Muslims, Christians, and Jews were living in that land, which was known as Palestine in the past, peacefully. There was no confrontation or any kind of hostility between each others. It was when the British took over from the Ottoman Caliphate and the Balfour Declaration happened, this all conflict started. And it actually officially went into another phase in 1948 when Israel established its own state. Obviously, the state that we want to achieve is that peacefulness which used to exist in the past. All of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together in harmony without any kind of second-class citizen that currently the Arab Israelis living in Israel actually have. They should all be equal in the sight of law, and let the people decide what they want to do, is which kind of government they want to have. Right now, you talk about 6 to 7 million of Jews. What happens to them? Because of Nakba, there are millions who are actually refugees living in Jordan right now. Nobody asked that question, what happens to them at that time when the Nakba happened? So we should be actually considering the holistic and the concept, the whole context together. And I really implore that peace happens between these two groups. But looking at the situation becomes worse and worse, and it's not going to go in any positive direction. What I'm thinking right now is impossible, although I wish it would happen. But what is happening right now, I'm going to tell you that Israel is going to continue to do the ethnic cleansing in Gaza and West Bank. They will continue to occupy, and eventually the whole land, which is currently Gaza and West Bank, will also become the part of Israel. And right now the map does not show Palestine anywhere, and the whole ethnicity will be lost using Hamas or PLO as a dummy. And this is not a fair fight at all, what is happening right now. So you have a big muscular guy killing a skinny guy right now, and there is another guy behind him, like America, funding it to feeding more money, making it more fat to actually kill that skinny guy. So this is what's happening, and this is by far not a fair fight at all. This is a genocide happening, and I don't think what I said will ever happen. So you don't have to worry about it.
Well, I don't think that's a peaceful resolution, Noorul.
Well, unfortunately, looking at how the people. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say let's let that lie. I think we can sort of know where the different positions are. Ralph, what would be your ideal outcome? What would be the right way for this situation to progress if Noorul's vision isn't your vision?
I think people have to be aware of the interactive nature of this conflict, that one side does something bad and then the other side reacts to it, and there's this cycle of violence which has gone on. And I'd like to go back to the vision of the 1990s, when there really was a peace movement and a strong perspective for a two-state solution. When the Oslo Accords were signed, they didn't specify two states, but that was really where they were headed. And the violence from both sides, Baruch Goldstein's massacre of Palestinians in Hebron, which inspired Hamas, Hamas's violence, which caused the election of Netanyahu in 1996, back and forth, the Second Intifada, all this. There needs to be some way of getting back to a point where both sides trust each other enough to live in a two-state solution. Perhaps that two-state solution would be a confederation. There are a couple of perspectives jointly held by Israelis and Palestinians to promote a confederation of two sovereign states, Israel and Palestine. However it works out, it has to be peaceful, and it has to recognize the sovereign and human rights of both peoples. You can't have one people winning over the other. That's not where we should go.
All right, I think on that note, we thank everybody for having joined us, and hopefully at some point we can get to a peace possibility, one that works for the people who actually have to deal with the conflict. Because as I pointed out on my first slide, and I'll sort of go back there, right? A lot of the people who are involved in this conflict, especially those who have the strongest perspectives, are those who aren't actually directly affected by the conflict. So hopefully those of us who are connected can find a way to move past the violence and create a state where both our populations can flourish. So on that, I want to thank our panelists for spending their time. I want to thank you for having joined us. And of course, we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. Where are the slides? Yes, we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard Sassoon. I previously did the Middle Eastern Islamic History series, which, by the way, covers this conflict for about 6 or 7 hours. You can find a link to specific episodes on the meetup. We also have a number of other series like Asian Philosophy, European Union Security, that I co-host with Aaron. And we have recently been talking about the Ukraine war a lot on there. There's Dead Languages with John Maloney, Powerful Women with Jane Prendergast, and a number of other series that we do. And of course, our older series are all on the YouTube page, and you can see our links here. So you can see all of our videos on YouTube. This video will be recorded. I believe it's Zach live streamed it. If not, it will be uploaded to YouTube in the next few days. It will be on that YouTube page where you see youtube.com/c/history-fitness-investing. And hopefully you see more of our content. I hope you've enjoyed our panelists and our presentation today. All right. Thank you.
Richard, I want to thank you and everybody else for this fantastic discussion and breakdown. And it's really great that, a whole bunch of people can come together and for more than a couple hours be able to, hold a pretty robust discussion about such a critical and important and charged sort of topic and set of issues.
Great. All right. And thank you so much for all of you who've left all these nice comments about what you've seen and what you've heard. And we hope to see you again. All right. Bye.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you. Take
Bye.
care, everyone.
Okay, bye.